As a recovering overly kind female who identified with Christianity, the amount of self-abandoning I learned, adopted, was encouraged, and then utterly destruction in my life that was insurmountable from it was huge. And that's what we're talking about this week, is how we self-abandon and the tricky ways this is weaved into our lives and how we can change that. And why should we? So I'm going to start with a brief summary of my story, a very quick synopsis. So I grew up in a Christian home, and I married a Christian man who regularly stonewalled. And the pattern would be I would bring up potential conflict, be ignored for 6 days, try to bring it up again, be ignored, and give up. That was the pattern. There was gaslighting, lack of empathy, an utter belief that other perspectives did not exist and were not legitimate. And it was emotionally and psychologically abusive to myself. And I could really tell in my body, like the amount of sickness and different challenges I had was huge. Then I had a baby, undiagnosed Hashimoto's, and antibiotics, and I was in the psych ward with a bipolar diagnosis, or misdiagnosis, but I wouldn't learn that till much later. I chose to go back to the marriage because I didn't want to lose my daughter. Same stonewalling non-relationship. I did the logical thing and had 3 more kids. And psychiatrists took me off medicine. Then there was another 5 years of icing, a declaration of bitterness, and basically my husband at the time said that he was angry at me and bitter because of a comment I had said 5 years ago when we were leaving church. I asked what he thought of the sermon. And his bitterness for this last 5 years, which was very apparent and felt, was my fault. And that was, again, I was the problem. That caused a major lack of sleep again and the cognitive dissonance. And then again, I went to the psych ward to get back on medication. Realized at the time that the definition of crazy was doing the same thing and expecting a different result. And I decided no more. And it was like, God, help me understand, because I'm obviously not understanding. The fruit of this tree is terrible, so I'm obviously not getting it. And then after 3 years of getting healthier, confronted my husband about the stonewalling and mentioned that I would divorce him if it didn't change. Stonewalled again. We were separated for a month, guilted back into coming back because of Christian books and family. Another 2 years. And then I decided on a divorce because the pattern was pretty much set that I would go to the psych ward every now and again and get on medication because it was so challenging for me. And yet I had a partner that wasn't willing to really work with me. So I wanted to be able to take care of my kids. Got a divorce, but then the challenge of unraveling and healing from all that trauma was its own process. And that's why I wrote the Unravel Notebook on Amazon, and have prompts and practices of healing that I used and can help be passed on for overly kind gals. The fascinating side of all this is we could dissect why was my husband like that, which is interesting. The challenge is, though, we cannot control others. We can control ourselves. And I was a chronic and perpetual self-abandoner. And that did not help. It came with huge physical health consequences, autoimmune challenges, mental health challenges, and did not serve me or the relationship. So the definition of self-abandoning is basically a consistent disconnecting from our own thoughts, feelings, needs and desires, and boundaries in order to maintain safety, approval, and connection. So we're going to talk about 4 points of how this all works out and lots of examples of how this plays out and how we can change it. So the first one, as a chronic self-abandoner that's recovering in a lot of ways and still finds myself self-abandoning in some ways, is the number one thing is abandoning our emotions. Many of us learned that certain emotions were unacceptable. And so we basically disconnected from our emotions and thinking I was actually raised at a time where it was like the heart is deceitful and above all things desperately wicked. Who can know it? And implying that our emotions are bad. And honestly, our emotions are fabulous. God created our emotions. We connect with Him emotionally. And our emotions are sources of information. but I had disconnected from my emotions. I resisted sadness, anger, fear, disappointment, and instead pursued toxic positivity. And I would gaslight myself with gratitudes. And again, gaslighting is like basically where somebody is manipulating the other person by questioning their reality and making them feel crazy. But I would do that for myself. Like, why? How could you be unhappy even though you're physically falling apart? Because you've got 4 beautiful kids and this, and like, you focus on the good and focus on that without addressing what's really going on and being a part of potential solution there. So I was suppressing healthy anger, and anger is a powerful emotion, and it's very helpful in understanding when a boundary has been crossed, when something doesn't line up for us. It's an alert system that we should be listening to. And anger was not allowed in my family growing up, and it was not allowed in my marriage at the time. And it did not helpful. It wasn't helpful because there was anger in there and I had suppressed it, and suppressed anger causes health problems in lots of different ways. I would avoid discomfort, the discomforting emotions, and, whatever I could do to like walk on eggshells so that I wouldn't have to feel even more, disruptions. So, at the time, my husband would walk around me, not look at me, not touch me most of the time because I was chronically in the doghouse. And that's an awful way to live. And in order for me to avoid the discomfort of that, I really had to disconnect myself, which, those are all like can serve us for a time, but are really toxic in the end and doesn't serve us. So I wasn't listening to my emotions, and my emotions were speaking very loudly. And instead it was manifesting in starting with health conditions, allergies, chronic illness, tendinitis, thyroid issues, all sorts of things. And then, get so bad that I'd stop sleeping. So there's lots of different ways we can abandon ourselves and our emotions. We can minimize our feelings. We can make jokes instead of expressing our hurt. And that was interesting. I had a hard time for years showing anger. And like I'd even almost kind of laugh and really struggle showing that anger. And it's interesting that I still struggle with that. In fact, I was at the car dealership this last week, and the car dealership supposedly called me, but I never got the message. So I waited all day, not hearing from them, left them a message. They never got it. And so I was without a car, trying to navigate that, not hearing back, and was angry. And so I went in there and I'm like, you know what? My tendency as a recovering self-abandoner, overly kind person, is to minimize, oh, that's okay, da-da-da-da. And I'm like, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to express my feelings and express my thoughts and hold space for that. I'm going to not have a smile on my face when I'm expressing my disapproval, because that was another thing that I would do. And I just said, I did not get the message, and I waited all day. And I also called you guys, couldn't get a hold of you. And then it sounds like you didn't get that message, and that sort of miscommunication did not help. It made my day very challenging, and it didn't get done like my what I was there for, because they had to order a part. So I expressed that, didn't make a big deal, didn't yell or anything like that, but I didn't stuff it. And my habit would have been to stuff it or minimize it or do it with a smile. And as part of my recovery, I'm like, no, I'm choosing differently, and I'm going to show my disapproval. But I'm not going to let it ruin my day, but I'm going to be honest. So it was pretty difficult. So it's funny how I still find myself like, oh my goodness, that's another self-abandoning thing. So yeah, just showing anger and learning to feel our emotions. Like for a long time, it took a while for me to understand all emotions and allow all of them. It used to be, oh gosh, don't allow envy or jealousy. All of those are bad, 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 bad. Rather than being like, you know what? God made emotions and their information, and they're meant to be felt. And so really getting in touch with, okay, what is this emotion? Where am I feeling it in my body? How big is it? What size? What color? And allowing myself really to go internally and feel it, because emotions are meant to process. It's like eating food. It's just meant to process through it. But if we don't digest it, then it's just like stuck. And so really learning to process and name and identify, and then be curious. Be like, I'm jealous. This is jealousy. Or I don't like to say I am. I like to say I'm feeling jealousy, or I'm feeling this. What is that saying to me? What am I learning from it? And, choosing, going from there. And that's been a big deal for me, like growing that capacity for emotions and not assuming there's wicked ones. So the old belief was it is wrong to get angry. The new belief are all emotions are valuable information. And the practice is I get curious about my feelings and actually feel them in my body, not judge them. And a good practice for me, I talk a lot about the school bus. Like our mind is like a school bus of all of our younger versions of ourselves. Then we've got some squirrels in there that are basically our emotions. And really getting curious, like what one of my parts or my children are being activated and what story am I creating? But if I keep it like a school bus analogy with some humor, it's like, oh yeah, my little 2-year-old just fell on the floor and is like throwing a little tantrum. It just gives it a little distance and a little bit of fun with it and really helps me understand like, oh, it makes sense that I would be angry because I'm using this story to say that, I'm not worthy. And that's actually not true. So and then comforting the little 2-year-old, and that's really a great way to reparent our little people on our bus and to really help ourselves now today. So the first one, as I mentioned, was abandoning our emotions. The second one is abandoning our voice. When we disconnect from our feelings, we're often disconnected from our voice. So it's not uncommon for us to have thyroid issues, things like that. I had a tumor on my thyroid. They thought it was thyroid cancer, but it was undiagnosed Hashimoto's. And I just did not feel that I could express I didn't think that my thoughts, feelings, and emotions were valid and that I could express them. So I wouldn't express my preferences. We're not advocating for ourselves. That was something that I didn't do. People pleasing, that was another way. And people pleasing is really interesting because basically we're lying about our thoughts, feelings, and beliefs in order to please others. And so it's really helped me to just be like, you know what? When I'm people pleasing, I'm actually lying. And that's helped me work with that habit and be like, yeah, that's not my choice. Very difficult giving honest feedback. Like it's so interesting. I find myself when I had an employee, I'd be like, oh, you've done such a good job and da-da-da-da, and could you please, and maybe look at this rather than saying, hey, could you get that done by the end of the week because I need it done. Like very difficult time having clear and concise language. And I'm still working on that. So that's another one. Honest feedback, very challenging. Over explaining is so interesting, like especially when we're saying no or doing something that may emotionally maybe trigger the other person then I'm over explaining in a way of soothing them. It's pretty interesting. And that is a chronic self-abandoning practice. Excessive apologizing, like anyone that says I'm sorry or is an automatic I'm sorry, that is usually a sign of somebody that self-abandons. And it's nice that we have these little red flags that are being like, okay, that's a sign of self-abandoning. And, we can be sorry for things that we do wrong, but accidents and these things, we can definitely look at that and say that differently and not self-abandon. So that's some good examples is like, gosh, like how often do you express a choice at a restaurant? Like maybe you want an avocado on your food. Are you comfortable saying, hey, could I get an avocado on that? Or going into a restaurant and they seat you somewhere and you're like, I don't really want to sit there, but I don't really want to say anything. Or do you say, hey, is that place by the window open? And so that's a great example for me. Another time, just recently, my husband, bought us a treat for dessert, and it was sugar-free Jell-O with Cool Whip or something like that. And I do not like sugar-free items. I don't like sugar either. But, I caught myself wanting to be like, go with it and be like, oh, that sounds good. The truth is it didn't sound good and I didn't want it. And so I had to cry. My first instinct was to people please. And I'm like, oh no, I can do this in a way like, thank you so much for the thought. That's so nice of you. And I really don't like sugar-free Jell-O, but I really appreciate the thought. So it was just funny how I catch myself still like with those little things. It's like, no, I'm going to choose to be honest. I'm going to choose to do that. And I can do it in a kind way, but not in a self-abandoning way. So the old belief I had with this was my needs aren't as important as everybody else's. My new belief is my voice matters. The practice is express one preference every day. Work to be clear and concise. And I have to practice this. It's an ongoing thing. It's not all of a sudden, yay, we're free. It's a process. I hope you've been loving my podcast and growing 1% at a time in our community. And if you've noticed that you want to get somewhere quicker, faster, or you need some personalized attention, then reach out to me because I do life coaching that involves both the conscious and the subconscious. And that is a way to get somewhere faster, to have personalized care. So reach out to me, sign up for a 15-minute free consultation to see if it's right for you, and we'll see if we can set something up. Make it a great day. So the third one, so we've abandoned, the first one was abandoning our feelings, and then the second one was abandoning our voice. The third one is abandoning our boundaries. How many women were taught that saying no is unkind? And so there's chronic difficulty in saying no. And especially this came across to me, probably like 10 years ago. I took a self-defense class. And in the self-defense class, the first thing you were supposed to defend yourself was to put up your hand and say, no, stop. Do you want to know how difficult that was for me? To use my voice and say, no, stop. It was so challenging for me. This was before I was divorced and before I really worked on a lot of this. Very, very difficult. So saying no has been difficult. Hearing no. And that's been another thing. One problem with, having difficulty saying no is because we have difficulty hearing no. And so really allowing and respecting other people's no's and getting curious about what does their no mean, rather than a rejection of me, or however we're going to tell it is what does that no mean? What are they trying to protect, or what does that mean for them? And kind of keeping that energy out instead of in when we hear no. There's a really good practice if you ever want to get a group of gals together and you can have one person be the one asking for all these things and the other one saying no in lots of different ways. And it can be really funny, but it gives you an immunity to know and to not take things personally, and reframes that. And it's a good practice to do that. Another part of boundaries is automatically saying yes. A lot of people, I'd always do you need somebody for this? Yes, I'll do it. Yes, I'll do this. And it would be at the expense of myself, my time, my energy, and it wouldn't be from a heart of love. It would be a heart of people pleasing and wanting to be valuable, rather than from an overflow of love and an overflow of taking care of myself so I have the energy to take care and do this for everyone else. And there's times where we abandon on purpose, but that's different than auto-abandoning. So instead of automatically saying yes, being give me a few seconds, or give me a day to think about that, and then answer it. Another part of boundaries and abandoning our boundaries is answering inappropriate questions. This really became apparent to me probably a year ago. I realized that when people asked me a question, I felt like I automatically needed to answer it. And I'm like, what is this? And I realized it was another sneaky way that self-abandoning had entered into my life. We do not have to answer people's questions and inappropriate questions. Another thing, I'd either answer it or I'd freeze. I'd be like, eh. And, if you ever freeze, the really good trick to do is if you ever start to feel the freeze, you ask them a question. It can be completely unrelated, oh, where'd you get that shirt? Or whatever. But as soon as you do that, it gets you out of the freeze mode. It's a really cool trick. We do not need to answer any inappropriate questions. And we can, even a question like, what makes you feel like you can ask that question? Something like that. So, and another part of self-abandoning with our boundaries is allowing mistreatment. Do you know how many women have been raped because they did not say no, or voice themselves loudly because they were concerned about embarrassing the man or making a scene or something like that? That happens, unfortunately, a lot. And that is, as we'll talk about soon, why we do all of this. But that is so sad if we think about that, and not okay. But if we practice self-abandoning, then we get in these situations where that's what happens. We self-abandon. So staying silent when boundaries are crossed, rather than being like, yeah, that didn't work for me. Or, depending on the person, sometimes, when that boundary is crossed, it is a no. But staying silent and not using our voices. So this is there's lots of good examples of bounding our boundaries. I've talked about a little bit, but again, there's verbal abuse. There's different things that can happen to us where we do really need to be hey, When you're raising your voice at me, that makes me feel scared, and I am not going to stay in the room because it's not constructive for us to work through this. So anytime you raise your voice, and it's best to talk to them before this happens. Anytime you raise your voice and I'm feeling scared, I'm going to leave, but I'm going to want to talk to you about this, but just not at that time. And we'll figure out a time we can meet to talk about it calmly. So those are an example of boundaries. And remember, boundaries aren't like us trying to control another person. It's like, when this happens, this is what I'm going to do. And then we have to stick to that. So the old belief is I'm responsible for everyone else's comfort. The new belief is I can be loving and still have boundaries. So again, the practice is to be and do say something an intentional no every week. Another example is to, again, practice the whole, asking someone, like you can do this in a game too, where you can have a friend ask you an inappropriate question, and rather than answering it, you can ask them a question back. So that's a practice to help us so that we don't get frozen if we're asked an inappropriate question, and it sets us up to be able to counteract it, to take the spotlight off of us onto the other person and not answer the question. So that is, and then the fourth way we self-abandon is abandoning our responsibilities to ourselves by taking responsibility for everybody else. This is where self-abandoning often becomes codependency, because we're trying to manage other people's emotions and we're trying to fix what they're going through and rescue them. You'll find this a lot if you're an auto advice giver, which I can be, until I realized that really I was trying to manage my own discomfort and I was manipulating rather than holding space. So that's auto advice giving. I was trying to control outcomes because I was not comfortable, again, with people's emotions and pain, and it was so uncomfortable to me. And I would feel really uncomfortable when other people were upset, especially if they were angry at me or felt like I did something wrong. And I did not have the ability to hold a lot of space for that. So again, some examples of the abandoning our responsibility for ourselves and taking responsibilities for everyone else is auto advice giving and trying to solve other people's problems. And then feeling responsible when someone is disappointed or angry. And for me, I've realized it's not good for me to live with someone that's constantly disappointed and condemning me or has contempt. And I don't think that's really good for anyone long term. And really kind of separating ourselves, not trying to emotionally maintain other people and giving them the respect in their journey, and not making it all about how ourselves, as far as what can we do. And it's very interesting how that works out, because we have to grow the capacity for other people to just be upset with us. And I love that. It's like, now I can, let people be upset with me, and I don't make that mean there's something wrong with me. There's times I do need to apologize and do need to do my part. Absolutely. But before, I was chronically the one repairing. And if it's a one-sided repair all the time, that's a flag, because usually it takes two people to repair. So the old belief is I don't feel okay unless everyone else feels okay. My new belief is other adults are responsible for their own emotions. This is their journey, and often their emotions are a reflection of who they are and less of a reflection of me. So the practice is really holding space instead of fixing. So when I have a friend that's wanting to share her challenges, sometimes I'll just ask her, or even my husband, do you want me to just hold space for you, or are you looking for advice? And so that way I can literally, if they just need to talk about it and vent, then they can do that. And I'm not trying to fix or anything like that. I can just hold space for them. So that's really helpful. So the question is, why do we do this? Many of us think these patterns are character flaws, and really they're just adaptations. As women, we're taught to be nice, be overly accommodating, don't be too much, think of others first, keep the peace, don't make people uncomfortable, submit, be agreeable, and selfless. And it's of those, and it's different at different times in my life, but the ones that I'm working on right now is don't make people uncomfortable. And it's like, okay, I'm comfortable making people uncomfortable if I need to, and to not be selfless all the time. So the messages came from our family systems. A lot of us have been taught, think of others more important than yourselves. You always need to be thinking about your siblings and this and that. Our church culture, especially how Bible verses have been nice and twisted. It's so funny. It's like the overly kind people and the teachable people are the ones that are hearing the be kind to one another. And the ones that are selfish, those are blown right past them. And so it's like understanding that there's different messages for different people, and a number of things in the Bible have been taken out of context and twisted, and that's a little bit concerning because we're not meant to self-abandon all the time. That is not how God designed us. In fact, we're going to talk about that in just a second. Also, society. It is so interesting that in general, it is, you could have, I remember hearing about this study that somebody did where it was a resume. And in one of the resumes, they just changed the name to the person's a female name. And in the other resume, they changed the name to a male name. And then they handed it out and asked them what their impression was of the candidates. And if it was a man's name, same resume, they're like, oh, he's a guy, strong leader, da da da. And if they had the woman's name, they're like, oh, she's a Karen, she sounds hard to work with, stuff like that. And so there is like some major bias and prejudice that we all have where like men can just speak it out and be bold and they're being leaders, but if a woman does it, it's looked at differently. And so I catch myself being like, okay, I've done that and thought that of others, and then also like just allowing myself to be clear and concise and all of that. It's just interesting how our society has really perpetuated this. I think a lot of us, we've gotten this message just as a survival technique. Like for me, in my previous marriage that was so destructive, I really learned to shrink myself in order to maintain the peace, because in my mind I was stuck in this and I was working with someone who wasn't willing to work with me. And so that was my best solution, except for it has such a almost deathly cost. So that doesn't work. But that's where it can come from, is like trauma, especially trauma as a kid, different things like that. And also it makes it a lot easier to do that sort of self-abandoning if we have an attachment wound. So if we're an anxious person where we're very uncomfortable when people are upset at us and we become anxious and then want to repair, that can help us be in an overly kind, overly self-abandoning person, rather than we need to repair that wound, that anxious attachment. And then again, like the misinterpretation of scripture, it's so sad to me. This is probably the saddest thing for me, is because unfortunately, especially when I see women coming out of domestic abuse from these Christian, quote unquote, Christian homes where these men are domineering, controlling, and awful, and then throwing scripture at them to make them submit. It's so sad because a lot of them attach like what they're saying is true about God's word, and it's not true. Like there's a lot, one really good way to understand this is if you read about Jesus and you read like Matthew, Mark, Luke, John in the Bible, there is nothing about him encouraging power and control and all of those things and how he elevates women. So that's a really nice flag as far as like, yeah. So if anyone's trying to use scripture to power and control, then that is a big red flag. And that was the biggest thing that Jesus spoke against, the Pharisees and Sadducees, who spoke about control, power, and looking good. And that was who he was against. So if the Bible is being used for power and control to torment you, to manipulate you, think again. So that's where a lot of us get these messages, and then our behaviors are rewarded because people like us self-abandoning because it benefits them. It works wonderfully to attract narcissists because the narcissist is kind of like the top of the kettle and we're the bottom of the pot. Or, they just fit together really well. And so it's unfortunately, and that's why I talk about the kind girl bullseye, is basically we attract that kind of person when we have this self-abandoning going on. So in order to get rid of that, we need to work on our self-abandoning. So again, the cost of self-abandoning is anxiety, depression, resentment, burnout, loss of identity, cognitive dissonance, staying in unhealthy dynamics too long, not trusting ourselves, physical challenges, feeling disconnected from who we really are, and really lacking purpose, because it's really hard for us to thrive and blossom when we don't even know ourselves and we're not even allowing ourselves to be in the world how God created us. So what may have protected us at one point, of maybe as a child we learned these skills, became the thing that was hurting us, and we need to change it. So how do we return home to ourselves? Well, first of all, it's about recognizing, choosing, changing the patterns. And a lot of this, when we're changing our belief system. And that's why I wrote the Unravel Notebook, is because that helps us in the process. And you can get access to parts of the Unravel Notebook on my website, which is livebrighter.info, and get some pages from that. But really, some things we need to understand: healing ourselves isn't selfish, it's healthy, and it's a way we become whole. We need to learn to support ourselves from within so we can show up more fully in the world. Also, learning what our thoughts and feelings and desires are, and then allowing them to matter. So the new belief and most important belief is we are made to be loved by God and love God and connected with Him. And then secondly, we're made to be loved and connected to ourselves, and then others, in that order. And that is what God prescribes, and that's what works. So along with that, we have changed our beliefs to: my thoughts matter, my feelings matter, my desires matter, my needs matter. I'm allowed to take up space and to make mistakes. I can love others without abandoning myself. So the goal is to stop being overly kind, but we can still be kind and have healthy priorities and boundaries and make room for ourselves. Because kindness without self-respect and self-love eventually becomes self-abandonment. So start today. Grow 1% at a time. I believe in you. Make it a great day.